This series is about perhaps the most powerful idea ever to occur to a human mind. The idea is evolution by natural selection, and the genius who thought of it was Charles Darwin. I'm a biologist, and Darwin has been an inspiration to me throughout my whole career. His masterpiece on the origin of species was published 150 years ago, and it changed forever our view of the world and our place in it. What Darwin achieved was nothing less than a complete explanation of the complexity and diversity of all life. And yet it's one of the simplest ideas that anyone ever had. When Charles Darwin was born 200 years ago, sailors and explorers were sending home a dizzying array of specimens like these from all parts of Britain's growing empire. Every animal was believed to have a unique place in God's creation, each made by God according to his perfect, unchanging design. At school in Shrewsbury, the young Charles Darwin was taught that God had created the earth and all this rich variety of life just 6,000 years ago. Today, thanks to Darwin, we know differently. Darwin was born into a prosperous Shropshire family in 1809. His father was a doctor and keen that his son should follow in his scientific footsteps. But the adolescent Charles, more interested in shooting and fishing than academic prowess, was contemplating an easy life as a country parson. Luckily for him, and for us, he had the opportunity to open his eyes to see the world. In 1831, as a young man of 22, Darwin's family connections got him a once-in-a-lifetime invitation. A round-the-world voyage on the survey ship HMS Beagle. Over 5 years, Darwin collected hundreds and hundreds of specimens to send back to the collections. But increasingly, he wasn't satisfied with just recording the animals and plants he saw. He was beginning to have doubts about the biblical story of how animals were created. While ashore, riding across the South American flatlands, Darwin amused himself by chasing after rheas, shy ostrich-like, flightless birds. But he was puzzled. Why had God bothered to create two very similar but slightly different types of rhea? Had an original group of rheas split in two and, once separated, started to develop in their own way? The mystery deepened when Darwin noticed an even more marked effect on islands. I was lucky enough to retread Darwin's footsteps on the Galapagos Islands last year. Here, he began to wonder why God would have created distinctive kinds of tortoise, finch, or iguana on more or less identical small islands. Were iguanas like these related rather than separately created? Were they cousins of the similar but different iguanas on nearby islands? This pattern of relationships became even more intriguing when Darwin encountered fossils. The evidence of fossils would help Darwin develop a theory of life on Earth far more wonderful and more moving than any religious story of creation. But Darwin was how, apart from their enormous size, the fossils closely resembled in every other detail the skeletons of modern sloths living nearby.
You can definitely see similarities in their details of their teeth, peculiar features that they share with modern armadillos, modern tree sloths, and actually modern anteaters. You know, we can infer that they are related to these animals.
The discovery of fossils was a huge challenge to the religious orthodoxy of Darwin's youth. What were these animals? When had they lived? And why didn't they exist anymore? Some suggested that fossils were just God playfully ornamenting his world. Others claimed they were the bones of sinners drowned in Noah's flood. But Darwin was one of the first scientists to correctly identify them as long-dead species of animals. He was starting to grasp that the Earth might be a lot older than the Bible led us to believe. And how had he realized this? Through a fascination with geology. Darwin had had time to immerse himself in the pioneering work of Charles Lyell. Lyell argued that the landscape we saw around us was formed by the slow action of vast forces, not thousands, but millions of years of gradual change. So, if the Earth was shaped and reshaped over an immense period of time, was there room, Darwin began to wonder, for life to undergo slow changes as well? With each layer you go down to, you find a completely different set of animals. And if you look at the animals that you find, and plants, over the great span of time, you find that they form a kind of ordered sequence. You find fish 400 million years ago, but you find no mammals at all 400 million years ago. The fish gradually changed into amphibians, changed into reptiles. Reptiles changed into birds, changed into mammals. The evidence Darwin had seen with his own eyes on the voyage of the Beagle seeded huge heretical questions in his mind. And once he started thinking, he couldn't stop. Darwin, once an easily distracted student, returned from the voyage of the Beagle a determined, even obsessive research scientist. The trip had changed him, and it was soon to change the world forever. Back in London in the late 1830s, the specimens he'd collected and his reporting of the voyage made Darwin a scientific celebrity. Even more importantly, while cataloguing his finds, Darwin realized that life forms weren't fixed. They had changed over time. They must have evolved. Now he wanted to pull together all the evidence to understand how and why this had happened. It took Darwin 20 years of research, on and off, to develop the ideas that would eventually be set out in The Origin of Species. He wanted to be fully certain of his facts. The hard graft was done here at Darwin's home, Down House in Kent. Long before the days of the internet, of course, Darwin drew upon the collective knowledge of an entire generation of naturalists all over the world. He sent out thousands of letters asking for data, posing questions, trying out theories. And back the letters flowed from all around the world into Down House, a river of information. Darwin studied the detail of how different mammals share remarkably similar skeletons. Their limbs have the same bones in the same order, just reshaped and resized to suit different ways of life. He was drawn to the similarity of early embryo development in very different types of animals: fish, birds, reptiles. Increasingly, he became convinced that every living thing must be related to every other. Darwin began to see the history of life as a vast family tree. Life began millions of years ago at the base of the tree, and as time went by, our ancestors evolved, split off and multiplied along branches, until now every species on the planet is a twig at the end of a branch. All are related, all cousins. Life had evolved from single cells into complex, sophisticated beings. It may seem like a huge leap, But Darwin realized it had been achieved by small steps over a vast span of time. He grasped the immense age of the Earth. Darwin believed the world was hundreds of millions of years old. Today we know it's over 4 billion years old, and the life we can actually see around us has existed for an insignificant blink of that time. He used this piano to illustrate the vastness of geological time, and yet how comparatively little of it is occupied by those animals and plants that we know anything about. If we have the origin of life at the bottom of the piano there, and recent times at the top, I find it astonishing that we have nothing but bacteria all the way up here, past Middle Sea, way up to about here, when more complicated cells than bacteria first evolve. And then we get the first many-celled animals, the first large animals somewhere here. Fish start around here. The dinosaurs don't come in until about here, and then the extinction of the dinosaurs around here. About here, the apes and monkeys, and the whole of human history would occupy a space less than the width of one piano string right at the top of the keyboard. Life had evolved over time, but how had this happened? Why hadn't creatures stayed the same? Darwin wasn't just an abstract theorist. He liked to get his hands dirty, testing his ideas. And in the 1850s, he became fascinated by pigeons. By how man had remolded the wild rock dove into a rich variety of forms. Darwin's bird specimens are now stored at the Natural History Museum at Tring. It's a very weird feeling. These are actually Darwin's own specimens. I see from Darwin's own label here that this is a blue owl pigeon. Tumblers are characterized by this curious tumbling behavior that they show, sort of falling through the sky. This one has been relabeled. It is a Darwin specimen. This one actually has Darwin's original label here. Darwin realized that, for centuries, through small steps, pigeon breeders had been in the business of evolution. Here was life in constant flux. One of the big things Darwin had to fight against was the feeling that people had that species were species and they never changed into anything else. Artificial selection on dogs, pigeons, cabbages was a beautiful illustration for Darwin of how plastic things were. You could pull them, it was like modeling clay almost. You could take a wild animal and pull bits out, press other bits in large bits. It was showing that there's nothing static about species. Species can change. Charles Darwin's work revolutionized the way we understand our world. For 20 years, he had pieced together evidence that proved the fact of evolution and developed a theory of how nature, not God, selects life in a similar way to humans breeding pigeons. How does nature select? In the cruelest way. Today, much of the world is controlled and cultivated by man, but there are still a few remote places red in tooth and claw. I've come to Kenya where I was born. It's one of the wilder places on Earth where the full force of natural selection can still be seen. As night falls, it's kill or be killed. The total amount of suffering in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute that it takes me to say these words, thousands of animals are running for their lives, whimpering with fear, feeling teeth sink into their throats. Thousands are dying from starvation or disease, or feeling a parasite rasping away from within. There is no central authority, no safety net. For most animals, the reality of life is struggling, suffering, and death. For Darwin, grappling with nature's horrors must have been a huge challenge. As a young man, he had wanted to become a country parson. He had believed in an orderly and harmonious animal kingdom. Now, he contemplated the brutal reality of nature. Darwin's brilliance was to connect what he was seeing with an idea from a completely different discipline, economics. Thomas Malthus had written a popular, influential diatribe about the perils of population growth in early industrial Britain, and how this would inevitably be stopped by food shortage and disease. Darwin seized upon Malthus's warning about a human struggle for resources, and he applied it to what was happening in nature. As more individuals are produced than can possibly survive, there must in every case be a struggle for existence. Nature is an arena of pressure. Of every individual born, the chance of it surviving to reproduce the next generation is very, very small. Most animals die young. The next step for Darwin was to realize this. What makes the difference between success and failure in the struggle for existence isn't just chance. All living things vary, even if only slightly. Darwin realized this was the key. A tiny variation, sharper teeth or faster legs, keener eyes, better camouflage, better sense of smell, can make a crucial difference in an animal's chances of survival. If an animal survives, it is more likely to reproduce and, crucially, pass those variations on to its offspring. Nature's struggle for existence means that organisms with helpful variations tend on average to survive and reproduce. Those without die without offspring. The race is survival. The finishing line is reproduction. This is what Darwin defined as natural selection. The plain truth. Where has all this wobbling come from? Well, it started right back in the 19th century, in Darwin's time. Rather than just denying the evidence, the Church of England developed the most sophisticated strategy to face the challenge of evolution. It saw evolution as one truth within a bigger one, and embraced Darwin in what one might call a comfortable relativist fudge. Science would explain the workings of nature, and God could take the credit for getting science started in the first place. It's a subtle argument put forward by the most powerful Christians in the world. Let's take it on in its modern guise. Even frightening. Darwin himself was shocked by what he called the low and horridly cruel behavior he observed in nature, and yet it was integral to natural selection. One piece of research shook Darwin to his core. He knew how some insects, like this parasitic wasp, lay eggs in the larvae of other insects so that their young, when hatched, can feed on them. They also sting each part of the prey's nervous system so as to paralyze it, but not kill it, to keep the meat fresh. So the victim may be aware of being slowly eaten away from inside, but unable to move a muscle to do anything about it. But what Darwin never cracked was how the improvements of natural selection were preserved from generation to generation, why they didn't become diluted by interbreeding. Darwin anticipated problems with his theory. Modern science has answered them. Evolution by natural selection has been triumphantly vindicated as fact.